All right. That looks like it is set and going. We'll give it our usual buffer for people to log in. And then we can get down to work. I hope everybody is doing well. And I think it's now time to get things rolling. So here we are at the end of Bamidbar, at the end of the book of Numbers. We stand at the threshold. Indeed, as we can see here from chapter 33, verse 50, in the steppes of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho, Adonai spoke to Moses saying, in many ways, this is the end of the primary narrative of the Torah. We have gone all the way from creation, through the lineage of Abraham, through the children of Jacob, through the time in Egypt, through our time in the wilderness, and now, 40 years later, we are standing at the threshold of the land of Israel, standing at that Jordan River and looking across at the first major city that we will be facing, which is Jericho. At this time, we need some more information. Now, in this particular chapter, we're going to get a discussion of dividing the land that is about to be conquered. But there is a more pressing topic that is coming right here where we are going to begin our discussion. And that is very clear based upon what we are viewing at this moment. Again, imagine yourself, if you will, standing there 3,000-ish years ago. You are on the Jordan bank on the eastern shore, meaning in the modern day country of Jordan, and you are staring across the Jordan River, and there in the valley of the river, you can see a city known as Jericho. Its high walls surrounding it. But let's put aside for a moment what's going to happen in the famous stories with Joshua and Jericho, and just try to understand that that means that the country we are about to go into is inhabited. There are people there. Yes, the land was given to Abraham and his descendants. And yes, we are the primary inheritors of this particular piece of that promise that God made to Abraham. But that doesn't mean the people inside the country are going to recognize or agree with this. What are we going to do? How will we handle this? There's a very practical concern, which is, well, there's going to be a lot of fighting. And indeed, the book of Joshua bears that out. But there is also a theological concern of what does it mean for this immature, nascent Jewish community, these Israelites in training, if you will, to come into this land with its current inhabitants. So with that as our setting, let's see the instructions that God is going to give at this point in the Torah. Picking up then with verse 51. Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, for indeed it was called Eretz Canaan at this time, the land of Canaan, you shall dispossess all the inhabitants of the land. You shall destroy all their figured objects. You shall destroy all their molten images, and you shall demolish all their cult places. All right, so let's just make sure we understand what's going on here. We are dispossessing. The harashtem here is generally understood by the commentators to being to drive out, coming from the same sort of root as gerusha, of to divorce, meaning to push someone from your home. The idea here is that the people that are currently living there, the dwellers on the land, Yoshivei Haaretz, are going to have to leave. And that's going to be accompanied not only by having them leave, but also by a destruction of their images and their molten images, and also their bamot, their elevated cultic centers. The bamot where the the places on hills or mountaintops where they would often have worship ceremonies for different idolatrous religions. All of that has to be destroyed. Okay, so we've got the dispossession, and we have an idea of erasing their religious practices. Verse 53 continues, because we're not done with our instructions. And you shall take possession of the land and settle in it, for I have assigned the land for you to possess. And you shall take possession. So over here, v'horashtem cannot mean to dispossess. You'll notice that it's looks very similar to our v'horashtem of 52, but we are not going to dispossess the land. We have to inherit the land. So this comes from the root word for inheritance. So we will finally be able to take possession as part of the inheritance that's been passed down for generations and was delayed by the Egyptian slavery. And we will then settle it. We will become the Yoshvei Haaretz. We will become the dwellers in the land. And we will, and we do so because it is God who has given the land to us for our possession, for us to inherit, to live in. That means, verse 54, you shall apportion the land among yourselves by lot, meaning there will be a random allocation, clan by clan. With larger groups, increase the share. With smaller groups, reduce the share. Wherever the lot falls for it, that shall be its location. You shall have your portions according to your ancestral tribes. So each one of the different tribes, apart from Levi, are going to receive a portion of the land, and that land will be allocated to be proportional to the clans themselves, and we know from later on will be divided proportionally within the sub-families of those clans. 55. But if you do not dispossess, do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those whom you allow to remain shall be stings in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they shall harass you in the land in which you live, so that I will do to you what I planned to do to them. All right, so that last thinly veiled warning is trying to say that it's not a question of whether we should or shouldn't, it's a question of must. If we do not remove the other inhabitants from the land as we come in, then there are going to be long-term consequences for our ability to survive in the land. And in particular, we too will eventually be, well, dispossessed. We will have done to us what we were supposed to do to them. And just a spoiler alert, sorry if you haven't read the rest of Tanakh, the rest of the Bible, but yeah, that's pretty much what happens, meaning that we do not take the land completely, and it is not settled completely at this point. And eventually, of course, during the Babylonian expulsion, we are dispossessed from the land by the invading empire of Babylon. All right, now, this may seem cut and dry, but like everything, it's not. And like everything, there's many different ways to both interpret and to learn from these different verses. But before we dive into these verses from chapter 33, are there any questions or comments? Okay, so I wish to draw your attention to this first verse here, where we get the general instructions that you will dispossess all the inhabitants of the land and you will destroy their cultic objects. Keep that in mind as we move into our commentary. I think we can make that a little bigger. There we are. Trying to be kind to people with smaller screens. All right. Even though the Torah says in Deuteronomy 20:16 that you must not allow a single soul of these 7 nations, the Canaanite nations, to survive, in this instance, meaning here in Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, the Torah does not speak of the 7 Canaanite nations, but about others who live amongst them. This is the reason the Torah chose its words carefully. that is to say, all the ones who dwell in the land, that the Israelites were to drive out even those people who lived there, who were not members of the 7 nations. So the Torah often will describe the archetypical nations of Canaan as being the 7 nations of the Canaanites. And here it does not use that term. And that also is going to help us then reconcile what could sound like a paradox. In Deuteronomy 20:16, it looks like this is going to be a war of wholesale destruction. And yet here it is a war of relocation, of dispossession. What's going on? Well, Or HaChaim is arguing that Deuteronomy 20:16 is talking about the actual Canaanites themselves, whereas here in Numbers, we are talking about the other people who lived in the land, that just like Abraham, who came from another land and came to dwell in the land of Israel, so too there would have been other people that were not actual Canaanites in any technical sense of the word, but nonetheless were living in the land of Canaan. And they too would have been idolaters, as was the entirety of that region at the time. And therefore they too needed to leave, that they were not allowed to remain, even though they were not Canaanite peoples in and of themselves. Alternatively, he suggests, however, that there's another way to understand this phrasing. The Torah refers again to a nation which the Israelites do not possess the strength to kill. At least they should ensure that they would leave the land and not remain in it. Or Chaim is offering a different explanation, that this isn't in Numbers saying that we're talking about the non-Canaanites, but instead we are talking about the Canaanites, that we need to make sure the Canaanites go. And here there is an exception being made among our treatment of the Canaanites due to our inability to actually overcome them in a direct conflict. That even if we cannot overcome them in a direct conflict, we should be spending all of our resources and efforts to, at the very least, to encourage them through violence and being strong against them to leave the land, to relocate themselves, to no longer be in the land of Israel itself. So these two interpretations are probably the simplest way to understand this, which is to say that the Torah is being very heavy-handed, very powerful in trying to say that when we come into the land of Israel, or the land of Canaan as it's known at the time, we should make sure that the land is emptied of the people who are currently living there. And we have to then keep coming back to the question, why? We know that Judaism has no interest in conquering the world. The Torah was not given to us so that we could take the sword and spread the Torah by blood. We do not have a history of religious empire building. Why are we so hell-bent on emptying the land of these current inhabitants? What exactly is the problem? Well, part of the problem is, as the text went on to say at the end of our chapter, that if we do not dispossess those inhabitants, that they will be a thorn to us. They will be a sting, a spike in the eye. And we have to then say, well, what kind of thorn, what kind of spike are we talking about here? Is this a military issue? Are they going to keep raiding us? Will they be attacking, destroying our crops, stealing people? What exactly is the issue here? And the issue, of course, comes from what we saw at the end of that first instructional verse, which is the destruction of the cultic places. This is not a question of nationality. It is certainly not a question of genetics or race. This is a question of the theology that will be a adversary to the growing connection to Torah and God that we are trying to establish at this point. That the danger here is not their spears. The danger here is their gods, their idolatry. And we can see that because as the Talmud goes on to discuss in Avodah Zarah, we have to worry about every level of their cultic practice. When we are destroying their cultic sites, when we are smashing their idols, when we are even tearing down just raised platforms on the top of mountains, to what lengths do we have to go? Because, there's a lot of that. And just as an illustration from Avodah Zarah, we get the following discussion. It was stated, the halacha in a case where a Gentile worships boulders that naturally become dislodged from a mountain is subject to dispute between the sons of Rabbi Chia and on the one hand, and Rabbi Yochanan on the other. So let's make sure we got the basic difficulty here. You have pagans, and they are worshiping rocks. There's a really, really amazing rock at the top of a mountain, and they bow down to it and offer up sacrifices to it, and that rock to them is representative of a god. And then that rock rolls down the mountain. It's not a god, so it's not going to keep itself there forever. At some point, it becomes dislodged. It rolls down the mountains. Are we allowed to use it? Obviously, if they had a big gold statue at the top of the mountain, we would not be allowed to use their big gold statue. But just a rock, what can we do about that? One side says they are forbidden. It's an idolatry. It's an object of idolic veneration. Therefore, whether it's in its place where it's worshipped or it just rolls down the mountain, it has become a symbol of their veneration, and therefore, like a gold statue, it is off limits. And one side says they are permitted. Okay, so let's get this a little bit more. What is the reason of the one who says they are permitted? The Gemara answers, the status of the dislodged stones is still like the status of the mountain itself. Just as in the case of a mountain, it is not the product of human involvement, and therefore it is permitted to derive benefit from it even after it is worshipped, so too these boulders, which are not the product of human involvement, are permitted. These were not sculpted rocks. These were not created rocks. These were just rocks. And as such, when they are not in their place of worship, they revert in our mind to being just rocks. Unlike an object that had been shaped and formed by human involvement, which was given its whole status, identity, its form by human action, which retains its status as being an object of idolatry, regardless of its location. But you'll notice the underlying tension here, which is we need to get rid of everything that is idolatrous, but idol worshippers are, shall we say, prolific with their faith. They will worship just about anything, whether it be a boulder, whether it be the mountain itself. Are we then not allowed to even walk on a mountain? Am I not allowed to benefit from going up the mountain? What happens if there is a river that somebody worships? Am I no longer allowed to draw water from the river? There is a tension here. We want to remove idolatry 100%, completely from the land of Israel, from amidst our people. Indeed, because we know that it is such a trap to our people, as we can have seen already with the incident of the golden calf, and then Be'al Peor, and just, well, not quite last week's, but in the end of Parashat Balak, we saw that idolatry is very, very tempting to the nation, and it needs to be eradicated. But because of the pervasiveness of idolatry, how do we go about doing that? And here is one example of finding that line of getting rid of idolatry while not having to remove ourselves from the entire land just because so much of it was worshipped as an idol. All right, questions or comments? All right, because that last twist of removing ourselves from the land because it has been so worshipped is a very real question, which is, wouldn't it be better for us to just go to a land that is not settled by Canaanites, that is not full of people that are worshiping the sun, the moon, the stars, the mountains, the rivers, the trees, and every statue of every shape that you can imagine? Why not just go to, well, I don't know, stay in the Sinai, right? It's uninhabited. That is what Bamidbar is, the wilderness. Just go somewhere else. God could have taken us to some remote island that had no human population and just establish us there and then be perfectly fine. Isn't this danger of idolatry, isn't the danger of the presence of these other people just too great? Well, but there is a problem. Well, not a problem so much, but there is a counter commandment, which is verse 53, and you shall take possession of the land. That this land, Eretz Israel, is actually something that we are told to take possession of. So maybe we'd have no choice. Maybe we have to be in the land of Israel. And indeed, in the next survey of opinions, we can see that this is a matter of significant discussion. Is there an obligation to live in Israel? Is it a mitzvah? Is it a commandment to live in Israel? Verse 53 might be interpreted that way. And indeed, as we can see here from the opinion of Nachmanides, Ramban, that is his opinion. Chief among the authorities who maintain that the commandment to reside in Israel remains in force throughout the period of dispersion is Nachmanides, meaning even when Israel is not in our control, when we are in the diaspora, we have been dispersed to the four corners of the world, nonetheless, there is still a mitzvah, still a commandment, that wherever we are, whatever our place, whatever the state of the land of Israel is, that we should all pick up and move there post haste. In his commentary on the verse, our verse, and you shall inherit the land and dwell therein, Nachmanides states that the passage is to be understood as a positive commandment to dwell in the land of Israel, while at the same time enjoining Jewry from establishing a national settlement outside of Israel. Nachmanides remonstrates that Ramban, in cataloging the various precepts, did not include the commandment concerning dwelling in the land of Israel. So he gets angry that Rambam doesn't appear to have included this mitzvah of dwelling in Israel, which we'll talk about in just the next paragraph. But he is trying to say that there is a double commandment here. There is the positive commandment to live in Israel, regardless of which era, and there is a negative commandment not to establish a national settlement, meaning an alternative nation of Israel somewhere else on the globe. That is not allowed. We cannot just pick a different country to go live in and make that ours. That there is one and only one place, the land of Israel, for there to be a nation of Israel. That Medinat Yisrael, the state of Israel, must be on Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. Now, Nachmanides is perhaps the most forceful of the commentators to make this command. As he already mentioned, Maimonides does not include the settlement of the land of Israel, this verse 53, as being one of his mitzvot. Now, we're going to get an explanation of why that is right here. Rabbi Yitzhak de Leon, the author of Megillat Esther, an early commentary on Maimonides' Sefer HaMitzvot, so one of the early writers about Rambam, maintains that Rambam omitted the commandment to dwell on the land of Israel in cataloging the 613 precepts of Judaism because he was of the opinion that the obligation to dwell in Israel lapsed with the dispersion of Israel following the destruction of the temple. So Megillat Esther's opinion is that Rambam would agree that prior to the destruction of the temple, that there was indeed a commandment to live in the land of Israel. And indeed, we can see that there are that there are special rules regarding living in Israel that are not applicable anywhere else in the world. For example, if a couple live in Israel and the husband wishes to leave Israel and go live somewhere else, the wife can force the court to force him to give her a divorce. Whereas if he just wants to move to another part of Israel, she does not have the same authority under Jewish law. So living in Israel seems to have a very powerful status. And what Megillat Esther is saying is that, yes, that idea of being a mitzvah, a commandment to live in Israel, was indeed the case, certainly in the time of the Torah reading that we're talking about, but that mitzvah was canceled, nullified, no longer in operation no longer an obligation after the temple was destroyed. It has not resumed, at least at the time of Rambam's writing of his mitzvot. Therefore, he couldn't list it as part of the mitzvot. Megillat Esther points out that the Gemara, in Ketubot 111a, interprets the verse, I cause you to swear, O daughters of Jerusalem, that you awakened not nor stir up love until it pleases, taken from Shir HaShirim, and this is interpreted to mean as an admonition not to rebel against the conquerors of Israel or to seize the land by force. And indeed, this was a mostly universal opinion throughout much of the last 2,000 years, most authorities saying that Jews were not allowed to go up as a group, as a concerted effort, as a certainly not as an armed rebellion to the land of Israel. Individuals moving there, perfectly fine, establishing communities, synagogues, all of the things that go along with living in a place, perfectly fine, but trying to seize the land, indeed trying to fulfill the commandment of verse 53, was prohibited by this interpretation of Ketubot 11a, or 111a, that it was not allowed. Indeed, this was often trotted out as a opposition to the early Zionist movement. When people in Europe said we need to go back to the land of Israel, then under Turkish Ottoman control, and try to establish a homeland for the Jews there, many people said, Ketubot 111a says you're not allowed to do that. You have to stay in Romania, Russia, wherever you happen to be living at the moment, and just put up with it. Or you can maybe move to America or somewhere else, but you're not allowed to go back as an organized effort to the land of Israel. Rashbam, in his own opinion, gives, this is based on his commentary from Baba Batra 91a, excuse me, states that while dwelling in Israel is not a commandment per se, the statement contained in the Gemara that it is forbidden to leave Eretz Israel other than in times of famine is based upon consideration that living in the land of Israel is a preparatory step to the fulfillment of commandments, Heksher Mitzvah, there being numerous commandments that can be fulfilled only in Israel. So Rashbam tries to split the difference, if you will. He says, it's not saying we have to live in Israel the way Ramban Nachmanides was saying, but it is saying that if you're living in Israel, you should probably stay there in general, unless there is a life-threatening reason why you need to leave. Because if you are living in Israel, then you have the opportunity to fulfill more commandments, because many commandments, especially those about the land, are obviously only applicable in the land of Israel. So in this way, Rashbam argues that it's not a commandment for everyone to pick up and move to Israel immediately, but he also argues that living in Israel is still an incredibly important act and one that should never be thrown away lightly. Sort of, like I said, a middle ground position. Jumping ahead to the 20th century, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was faced with a difficult position. Being a rabbi in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, he was faced with the very strong situation that the Zionists were successfully enabling hundreds of thousands of Jews to come back to the land of Israel, and that many of them were arguing from religious grounds that they should, and many more, especially in the Orthodox world, which he was a rabbi in, one of the chief rabbis in the American Orthodox tableau, that it was not allowed, again, going back to their interpretation of Ketubot 111a. So how would he try to steer people when discussing whether or not living in the land of Israel is a commandment? Well, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein distinguishes between two distinct categories of positive commandments. There are precepts whose performance is mandatory: circumcision, the wearing of phylacteries, meaning tefillin, and the like. And others which are not mandated as obligatory responsibilities, but nevertheless, when indeed performed, constitute the fulfillment of a commandment. So just make sure you understand the general categories that he is trying to describe. He's saying there are certain commandments that you have to do them. If you have a baby boy, 8 days in good health, after the birth, there needs to be a brit milah. If you are above the age of bar bat mitzvah, although he would have said only bar, when you are doing the morning prayers, you need, which you must do, you need to wear tefillin. This isn't an option. This is something you have to do. On the other hand, there are other commandments, which, as we're going to see, is the settling of Israel is one of them, which you are not required to do. You are not obligated to do it. But if you do it, you are indeed fulfilling a commandment. I'll let him continue this analysis. Rabbi Feinstein maintains that even according to Nachmanides, residence in Israel is not obligatory because this commandment is not a mandatory one. According to this interpretation, Nachmanides' position is that the act of dwelling in Israel constitutes the voluntary fulfillment of a commandment rather than the discharge of an obligation. Rabbi Feinstein is trying to say, again, as a middle ground position, is that no one, in his opinion, is under any obligation to go to the land of Israel to live. However, if you are in the land of Israel, you have performed a mitzvah. You have fulfilled a commandment. Now, this may seem a little odd that there can be commandments that aren't exactly commandments until you've done them, at which point you did a commandment. But it's important to sort of structure this with an idea of the difference between obligation and the performance of a mitzvah that is not obligated. So if you understand Jewish law, we have what are known as, we are in a state where there is a chiyuv, there is an obligation, where we are, if you will, born in debt. I am born owing God the wearing of tefillin. I am born owing God the performance of Shabbat. This is something that is my obligation. And we say that when you fulfill it, you exit your obligation, or as he puts it in the translation, a discharge of an obligation, that you have fulfilled it. It's like having a debt, like any other debt. You owe God 100 mitzvah points. And I hate making it like that, but just work with me for the analogy. You owe God 100 mitzvah points. When you have done the mitzvahs, you are now at 0. You have fulfilled your obligation by reaching 0. What Moshe Feinstein is trying to say here is that that's not the way dwelling in Israel is. Dwelling in Israel is you have 0 obligation, but if you do it, you earn positive mitzvah points. You earn points for having done it, but you don't lose points or don't remain in negative territory for failing to do it. It is not an obligation, but it is something that is commendable if it is fulfilled. And then finally, the last opinion we see in this passage, dissenting sharply, Rabbi Yosef. This is Ovadia Yosef, one of the former Sephardic chief rabbis of Israel, asserts that the commandments constitutes a mandatory obligation, and that even in our own day, there exists a definite obligation upon all who fear the word of God and his commandments to ascend to the land of Israel. Now, as you can see, this is from a book called Contemporary Halachic Problems. And as you can probably also gather, this is a much longer chapter than the selection that I have brought for you today, because this is a continuing contemporary halachic problem. There is still a lively debate. It should not come as a surprise that Ovadia Yosef, the final voice that we saw here, was a rabbi in Israel, one of the chief rabbis of Israel. No surprise that he is of the opinion that living in the land of Israel is an obligation of all Jews everywhere in the world. Everyone right now should be packing a suitcase and moving to Israel. It should also come as no surprise that Rabbi Feinstein, living in the United States of America, was not of the opinion that everybody was obligated to go pack a bag and move to the land of Israel. That instead people had the choice. While it might be commendable to live in Israel, it was not an obligation to live in Israel. And indeed, this continues to be a debate more or less along those same lines in the modern times. People who live in Israel are often of the opinion that it is an obligation to live there for everyone, and they don't understand why the rest of us are so reluctant. And the rest of us point out to the fact that for 2,000 years, it was not considered an obligation to live in the land of Israel, as evidenced by the fact that for 2,000 years, the vast majority of Jews did not either live in the land of Israel or seek to live in the land of Israel. Therefore, establishing that the living in another country was perfectly fine. However, I will point out, everybody agrees that the establishment of an alternative Jewish life, in the sense of a state, an actual political entity that is run by Jews outside the land of Israel, is not something that is acceptable. When people suggested that the Jews be given land in some other corner of the world, something other than Israel, Uganda being the most famous one that was discussed at different times, the vast majority of Jewish opinions around the world said, no, we are not looking to build a Jewish homeland just anywhere. We are looking to live in the land of Israel, despite the complications that would come with it, despite the fact that it wasn't completely empty at the time, although it did have a relatively small population, despite all of the complications with the Turkish Empire and then later the British Empire. People felt that there wasn't an alternative to having Israel, or having Medinat Israel, the state of Israel, in Eretz Israel, in the land of Israel. All right, before we return to the biblical times, any questions on this modern debate? And no, I'm not going to settle it for you, although the fact that my zip code is here in Florida might give you some opinion of where I stand.
I have a question, and I guess it's really one of interpretation, because verse 51 opens, when you cross the Jordan to the land of Canaan, and then it gives the list of these things you shall do. The question is, 53, about possessing the land, is that independent from the when you cross the Jordan, in which case settling the land is a positive mitzvot, or is this one of these mitzvot that depends on the time? Because there's mitzvot that depend on the time, when or at this time, and so that kind of turns the analysis how you're going to look at it.
Correct. There is a question of, do I have to cross the Jordan? And if I don't cross the Jordan, am I no longer under obligations from verses 52 and 53? Also, are verses 52 and 53 only in force when I am fulfilling this specific time-bound, time-locked idea of crossing the Jordan after the Exodus from Egypt? And indeed, those are some of the points that many different commentators will raise, that it is not obligatory to settle in the land at this point, because we are not fulfilling verse 51. We are not the biblical Exodus being fulfilled right at this moment. But of course, other people will argue that this is not if you find yourself in the situation, but rather a general statement of, you will take possession of the land of Israel whenever, wherever, however. It's always going to be your obligation. That being the opinion of Ramban. I wish they had better last initials to keep it clear, because my tongue really doesn't always want to choose the right one, or the opinion of Ovadia Yosef. But let's come back to that question of the people that were living there and what we're doing by coming into the land of Israel, because it's not exactly easy to get our head around the idea of driving out the population, let alone the idea of waging a total war campaign against them. Well, we take from the introduction that was put in by Everett Fox in his translation of the Torah. Before Moshe lays out the future borders of Israelite Canaan in the next chapter, he must warn his charges about the dangers of leaving the conquered peoples and their religious culture settled in the land. This concern is typical of Deuteronomy and figures in later history. If you take a look at Judges, going from chapter 1 all the way through, where the apparent failure to do what is demanded here is understood as having led to idol worship in Israel. So he is trying to bring a little bit of history to our situation by pointing out that, yeah, apparently we did not succeed. Apparently there still were people living there, and more powerfully, for the difficulties that we see in the book of Judges, we left their cultic practices in effect. Or indeed, we even adopted them as our own. That far from a war of dispossession, there was certainly fighting for room and seizure of land, but the one thing that we really failed to do, by and large, was actually fulfill that second half, which was we were dispossessing them in order to remove the idolatry. In many places, we dispossessed the people there, and we kept their idolatry, which is the worst of the failures imaginable. If we had been able to remove idolatry, but not the people, the history would have been much smoother than having done it this way, where we occasionally removed the people, but adopted their idolatry in their absence. Indeed, Akedat Yitzchak gives us much that same idea. After listing a review of the last 40 years, the Torah gives instructions for the future: to drive out the Canaanites, division of the land by lottery, the reason why former residents must not be tolerated in their midst, to ensure their religious and national purity. Spiritual well-being is even more important than the physical amenities the land had to offer. For that reason, God is apparently cruel in insisting that all the survivors of the 7 nations in Canaan be killed, which would be an act of kindness towards Israel. They are warned that survivors would become pricks in their eyes, blinding them concerning their real interests if they would be tolerated. In the book of Judges, that we find details about how toleration of the remnants of the Canaanites spelled trouble for Israel in its homeland for many hundreds of years. And not only just up for a few hundred years, it really only stopped with the destruction of the first temple. It wasn't as though we figured it out somewhere along the way without horrible national catastrophe in the process. Like I said, the very end of the chapter says that if we don't do what is necessary, it will happen to us. And indeed, that is what came to pass hundreds of years later. But you can understand Akedat Yitzchak's passion here. He is saying that this was, at that moment, a fundamental necessity, that the nation needed to have a spiritual purity that allowed them to remain connected to God without the contamination of idolatry. And unfortunately, we don't know exactly what that history line would have looked like, because we didn't. We did not remove the idolatry, as we saw from Everett Fox's analysis, and as I've mentioned before. And we, in fact, not only allowed it to exist with us, we adopted it and blended it into our practice as well. And we can see the problems in the book of Judges, and then throughout the rest of Tanakh, up to the destruction of the first temple. It feels very difficult to us in the modern world. We are hopefully confident, self-assured, strong Jewish people. We have the beautiful state of Israel in the modern times, which allows Jews to live in a way that is inconceivable for most of the last 2,000 years. And even in other countries, such as here in the US, Jews enjoy a vitality and a freedom that is unprecedented for the last 2,000 years. The Jews who came out of the land of Egypt did not have that luxury. Not only were they surrounded by incredibly antagonistic nations and cultures, they were also very susceptible to the infections of idolatry. They had a weak immune system, if you will. They were able to catch any and every cultic behavior that they came up against. They would worship whichever god they stumbled across. They would adopt the idols of any god. They would bow down at a moment's notice to any whim or wish of any of the foreign cultures that were around them. As such, they needed an environment of quarantine. They needed isolation to develop their immune system, to be more robust. Sadly, they did not get that, mostly because of their own stubbornness. And sadly, it's taken a very long time until we've reached a more a stronger immune system that we have today, which is why we are not tempted by idolatry in anything like the common temptation that was present in their time. Just as one little side note, the people who were there in the land, the Canaanites, first of all, they were offered peace. They were allowed to leave if they wished peacefully. And additionally, no one should equate anyone as currently being from among the 7 nations. Very importantly, the rabbis understood that all of the ancient nations had been so dispersed and disturbed by the conquests of the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, everyone in those, and then the Romans, and then obviously the later generations, but even during the rabbinic times, that none of the titles from the ancient world were still applicable to any of the people who happened to be living in those jurisdictions at that time. So during the time of the rabbis, if you lived in Moab, or what was historically known as Moab, you were assumed not to be a Moabite. If you lived in the area where the Edomites had lived, you were assumed not to be an Edomite. And that goes to this day. There are no Canaanites, there are no Amalekites, there are no Moabites, Edomites. We still have us, but everyone else has been diluted and distributed to such a point that we should not point a finger and say this person is a Canaanite. Indeed, the laws of the actual wars that were waged are indeed understood by almost all authorities as being very specifically time-bound, only to that period of Moses and then Joshua's conquest of the land. Questions or comments before we finish for today? All right, well, thank you all very much for studying with me, and I will see you next time.